Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kushner.
And I'm Ramin, Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate a path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. We're so glad to welcome Brendan Slagle, one of the leads of our clinical operations team here at SSI Strategy, where we're going to be really reflecting on our last episode with Marshall Summer about the complexities of rare disease clinical operations and what it takes to really get drugs developed in this space. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, it's great to join, and I think the last episode really touched on some important themes in the rare disease space. And as I think a lot of people may be aware, just in the very name of rare disease, it's clear that they're very different from other diseases, and studying them is similarly unique.
Absolutely. One of the things that I thought was very interesting in our last episode, and I'm jumping right in a little bit because, Brendan, I know you've had some really wide experiences in the industry in rare disease, non-rare disease, newer modalities. And I think there's a complexity in how we addressed rare disease studies overall. And then there's an added complexity when you add a new modality or a new approach to bringing a different kind of therapy to a rare disease. And so as a lead from the clinical operations standpoint, you're trying to manage not just how to take the baton in a relay of a development plan and a protocol, but really weigh in on a lot of those elements as early as possible so that the study design itself can be managed for those complexities. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the complexity of adding new modalities versus traditional small molecule and how that plays out differently in the rare disease world.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to consider, and something that really needs to be talked about early on in the study design and just program design. When you're looking at going, for instance, into a gene therapy that may have a delivery via ICV or intrathecal delivery rather than an IV infusion or an oral tablet administration, you're really looking at a much broader team that needs to be involved at the site for just drug delivery, and it requires quite a bit of operational planning from the get-go to make sure that sites are equipped to bring the patients in, administer the investigational therapy, and then also to have the support and follow-up care available afterwards. So I think the more complex the treatment modality, the more lead time you need to build into just having those conversations and just exploring what could work, what can't work at the site level.
I do totally agree. And I'm going to take the opportunity to Ramin to also put you in the hot seat here. And one of the things that I've personally observed with rare diseases is that it is an area in drug development where it's almost impossible to operate in silos. Mm-hmm. You need development, operations, medical affairs, all involved in the early study design, all involved in the study operations. Nothing can be let's just wait and see how it plays out, and then we'll invest or plan for or build at that stage. And so coming from clinical operations, Brendan, where you're sitting, Ramin, you've been a long-time leader in the medical affairs world in rare disease. How do we start to bridge bringing all of those voices to the table at the early days? And maybe to be a little provocative and take it a step further, when we think about big pharma and the challenges that large pharma companies have with drug development in rare disease, do we think it has to do with that and the fact that bigger companies naturally operate in silos by way of how they're designed and how they have to operate, but rare disease can't work that way? And we know drug development is different in that way. So I would love for both of you to maybe give a perspective of that and how it's played out in each of your careers.
Right. No, I mean, first of all, it's more and more I'm starting to see that even in big pharma, as big as huge they are, they're starting to realize that they got to break down these silos. because these silos is really, it slows everything down, right? And they want to get the drug faster and faster to the patients. The community expects it to come to the market faster. And I think that's one area that overall, probably not fast enough that we're getting better at it, but things are kind of starting having that conversations. And you see that in a bunch of different companies. I think it's a really good question. A lot of it comes down to the management. A lot of it comes down from top down, right? Breaking these silos and not looking at trials as a kind of passing on the baton has to do how the management and leadership views the drug development. Drug development has to be done in a coordinated fashion. And I'm glad you mentioned all those functions, but even more important than those are the investigators, are the clinicians, and are the patients and the advocacy groups, right? We have to hear from them what's really important to them, what's really meaningful to them, and what's even doable. A lot of times I see that this isolation between what we think in a company and is one thing, and then you have another group, which are the stakeholders that are outsiders, right? And we go to them after we've already designed everything. Obviously, that doesn't go very well. And I think being able to give that seat to the different multi kind of a functional approach is such an important thing for the companies to do. Even in the smaller biotech companies, by the way, with only a dozen or a couple of dozen people, you could have silos. It's really not the size, right? It's just keeping an open mind that your partners and your stakeholders, your colleagues in other groups can also add a lot of value from their own perspective, right? And being able to collaborate with them is incredibly important. So that was a long way to answer the question. It comes down to the mindset of the organization, of the leadership and the executives.
Yeah, to build on your comment about just getting the investigator perspective, getting the patient perspective early on, I think that's important for a number of reasons. One is, it gives you valuable insight that you can use to design your studies, but it also makes them more engaged and gives them more ownership in the development of something. So if you bring them in earlier on, you have them weigh in not only on potential study endpoints, but the logistical elements of the trial, the timing of lab collections, the timing of visits, and building in some flexibility there. I think it really gives credibility to the sponsor in terms of taking in that voice of patient, that KOL input, and then also gives the community and the investigators a bit more ownership in having a hand in designing some of this stuff, so that if there are challenges, they're a little bit more willing to work with you and try to find solutions. And I think just one more point on that, it's important to get this input and also use this input. If you get this input late in the game as sort of a box checking exercise, once the protocol is essentially finalized and you don't actually incorporate any of the feedback that you get, that can really burn you and have the opposite effect, where it undermines your credibility and your commitment to the community.
Totally agree. And one of the things we not only spoke about in the prior episode, but also I've experienced quite a bit, is this balance in designing trials for disease, whether you're working with the investigators or not. Hopefully you do have the investigator voice early on as you're working through this, but defining your secondary endpoints and the balance between what you would love to know about the utility of the asset versus what's feasible and what really makes it an incredibly operational, challenging study to execute on, or for patients to want to participate in, or for caregivers to actively follow through with. And so from your perspective, how do you think about that balance, especially in rare disease where there's so much unknown, so much we would love to better understand, but we have to keep it simple in order to really be able to execute?
Yeah, I think this really comes back to, our mantra of thinking with the end in mind. So with the various stakeholders involved, you have regulatory expectations for your trial. You have, just patient community expectations for, what's important to them. But, at the end of the day, you're also going to have payer expectations for data. So I think it's important early on to, take kind of a long view of the data that you'll need to get across the program. It doesn't have to necessarily be comprehensive from the start, but look at, in a perfect world, this is the data we'd like to get in patients. This is, when we would want to have the data by, and then work backwards to build that into your protocol. But then where you have, that need, inevitably you're going to have, 100 different endpoints that you're trying to capture in a study, and that's just not feasible. Be really strategic about prioritizing the ones that you keep in the protocol. Remove the ones that aren't necessary or that are too burdensome, but don't lose track of them. Plan those for future studies, future clinical evidence generation activities, potential investigator-initiated trials, collaborative research projects, other things like that. So you're building the whole story, not just focusing on a single study design.
I was just kind of build up on what you were saying is that there seems to be sometimes there's a clash of traditional way that we used to do clinical trials, which is very different than the rare disease, right? In the rare disease, to the point you're making is we got to also think about and have an open mind to taking this study to the patient, right?
Yes.
A lot of these patients have a lot of limitations, right? And sometimes they cannot come to the office for 4 times a week or 4 times even a quarter for visits for whatever testing that needs to be done, right? And in a traditional way, it's one way or you cannot join this study, right? With the rare disease, you have to have that flexibility, especially with all the tools that we have right now with regards to, digital applications and digital tools that we can use with the patients. It becomes really, really important to kind of having that type of an approach to this study, making sure that, yes, you're collecting to the data. And Brandon, you're right. I mean, we look at, when you're talking about the other trials, you look at to collect as much as data that you can in one shot. And in rare disease, doesn't quite work that way. You got to get enough to be able to have a regulatory approval pathway, right? And then the rest you can collect the data as go on. And one thing is also the more when you look at and when you study the FDA, the EMEA, their guidelines for rare disease is very flexible. And as long as you're collecting data in a meaningful, compliant way, they don't really care how you're collecting it. But sometimes the companies haven't come around to accept that yet. And that becomes a challenge.
What do you think we can learn from everything you just described in terms of keeping studies simple, making sure it's operationally executable, making sure the investigator voice is early in the development cycle, breaking down silos? How do we pull that into larger disease areas, which I feel like we started this conversation and the prior conversation that rare disease is just different. And so we need to operate differently. But we also know that there's massive challenges when you look at study execution and ability to run trials for all the innovative medicines that are being brought to market, even for mass therapeutic areas. And so when we think about cardiology as an example, what do you think we can take from the rare disease world that might help us be more efficient in what we can maybe do in some of these other areas?
So I think an area that is, it's a necessity in rare disease, and that is a little bit more challenging, but certainly still doable for larger diseases and, larger clinical development programs, is just doing that initial landscape assessment of what evidence is out there, defining what the unmet medical need is, and looking at for existing therapies what endpoints they use to get approval. I think a lot of times the focus in designing a program is let's look at the endpoints that the last drug was approved based on. We'll use those as primary endpoints. Build our sample size to meet or beat that. But there's a lot left on the table with relation to learning from natural history data, learning from other more exploratory endpoints and things like that. And if you take the time to go through and look at some of the research that's being done more broadly, I think you can, fold in some of those other elements and unique endpoints that have that more patient-centric focus into larger programs as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think you've heard it on this podcast and also the previous one. The patient centricity and patient focus is so incredibly important. And it's not, and when we think about patient and patient voice early on, which we don't really necessarily do as much as we should for larger clinical trials, right? We should also think about the access, right, very early on, because at the end of the day, you may have the approval and the drug will be very, very effective. But if there's no access, if there's no pathway for access and reimbursement, the patient still will not be able to get the drug, right? Or they have to jump through multiple different hoops to get the drug. So thinking about also access as an endpoint early on in larger clinical trials. In rare disease, we're kind of forced to, because these trials are very, very expensive and also very limited number of the patients. There is really not a whole lot of room to things in a wrong way. So we start thinking about access usually a little bit sooner. But for clinical, for a larger one, access has to be part of another voice, another stakeholder that we need to think about very, very early on to make sure that, yes, even though you have the best science, you have the best data, and you were able to execute on it, right? How are the patients actually going to get this drug? And you got to think about that globally. It's not just the US, it's not just the Europe. There's 198 countries in the world, right? So you want to think about that in a very comprehensive way, right? And that's again goes back to what we were talking about, the silos. The silos are not just within the function, is also within the regions, and that comprehensive way of approaching things make a huge difference in the success of the clinical trials.
Absolutely agreed. And as we think about drug development in any disease state, and whether we're thinking the operational excellence of it or early design, making sure that we're developing medicines that patients can actually use at the end of the day has to be the goal. And I think it's a critical reminder that we all like to say we don't need, but we always need it anyway, because we get lost in all of the nuances and the intricacies of what our studies need to do, that it's easy to forget that somebody needs to pay for it. Somebody needs to be able to fill it. And when we think about these larger disease states where there might be competitive products on the market, it is about patient preference, and it is about knowing that you're developing something that is going to be ultimately best for the patients at the end of the day. And so really appreciate these insights, really thinking about these complexities and what we can learn from the rare disease world, bring it to some of these larger studies, but also how to break down the silos in our industry and making sure that we're really driving that outcome that we're all looking for. Brendan, thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI Strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.